They say grief brings families closer, but mine used it as a weapon. On the day I buried my father, I thought the worst pain had already struck me. I stood at his grave with tears blurring my vision, clutching the last pieces of comfort I had left. But I was wrong. The real heartbreak was waiting for me after the funeral. Instead of arms to hold me, I faced humiliation. Instead of love, I was met with cruelty. My own uncle, the man who should have protected me, tore my life apart with words sharp enough to wound and actions cold enough to shatter. He stripped me of my home, my dignity, and even my freedom, reducing me to a price tag, $20,000. I stayed quiet. What could a grieving daughter say when the world had turned against her? Silence was the only weapon I had, and so I held it close, burying my pain deep inside where no one could see it. But silence is never the end of a story. My father's death wasn't just an ending. It was also the beginning of a revelation he had left behind. A secret buried in his will, hidden from those who thought they could destroy me. And when that truth came to light, it didn't just change my life. It shook my entire family to its core. My name is Sophia, and I was 24 years old when my life collapsed in ways I never imagined. The morning of my father's funeral was heavy with grief. I remember standing by his coffin, numb, my fingers trembling as I touched the polished wood. It was the last time I would be close to him, the man who had been my entire world, my protector, my guide. The church was filled with the murmurs of relatives and neighbors, but their whispers felt like knives cutting through my already broken heart. As I stood there, my uncle approached me. I had hoped for at least a shred of comfort from him. Instead, he leaned close, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing without your father. Do you really think you belong in that house anymore?" His words hit harder than the icy wind blowing through the cemetery gates. I froze, too shocked to respond. When the burial ended, I returned to the family home, the place where every corner still smelled of my father's cologne. I thought, foolishly, that I could cling to that comfort. But my uncle had other plans. In front of gathered relatives, he pointed at me and spat venom. "You don't deserve to stay here. You're a burden, and I won't carry dead weight." The humiliation was sharp, burning through me like fire. Faces I had known all my life turned away, avoiding my eyes, as if agreeing with him. No one stepped forward to defend me. I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet. And then, with a cruelty I will never forget, he ordered me to pack what little I had. But his betrayal didn't end there. Later that evening, when I thought the worst had passed, he revealed something darker. He had struck a deal, selling me off, as though I were an object, for $20,000. The words felt unreal, like something from a nightmare. My uncle, my father's own brother, reducing me to a price tag. That day, I didn't just lose my father. I lost my home. I lost my freedom. My grief was chained with humiliation and fear. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my father had always taught me that patience carried its own power. So I stayed quiet, swallowing the bitterness, holding the weight of betrayal inside me. I remember lying awake that night in a stranger's room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. My uncle's sneer haunted me. The faces of the relatives who did nothing carved themselves into my memory. I felt stripped of everything, dignity, belonging, even identity. But beneath the silence, a small ember of resolve burned. My father had always told me, truth cannot stay buried forever. I clung to those words like a lifeline, not knowing how true they would prove to be. I didn't know then that my father had left behind something far greater than grief. A secret that would unravel everything. A will that would expose truths my uncle desperately wanted to bury. A revelation that would turn the entire family upside down. For now, though, I carried the pain in silence, waiting for the moment when patience would turn into power. The days after my father's funeral stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. I had thought losing him would be the worst pain I would ever face, but the betrayal that followed hollowed me out in ways grief alone could not. My uncle's cruelty was not just in what he did, but in how easily he convinced others to turn their backs on me. I was forced to leave the house that had been my safe haven, the home where my father and I once shared laughter in the evenings, sipping tea by the old fireplace. Each memory clung to me like a ghost I couldn't shake. Now I was cut off from it all, exiled as though I had never belonged there. The people who took me in after my uncle's deal treated me not as family, not even as a human being, but as if I were something purchased and owed. Every time I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the woman my father raised, but someone reduced to a number, $20,000. It was a weight that pressed on me constantly, reminding me of my uncle's betrayal. Silence became my only companion. I swallowed my rage, my humiliation, my despair. I wanted to scream at the injustice, to cry until my voice broke, but I knew none of it would change the reality of my situation. Speaking out would only invite more scorn, more disbelief. My uncle's influence stretched far, and I was just a young woman with no power, no home, and no one willing to stand beside me. There were nights when I curled up on the thin mattress in the small room I was given, clutching my father's old handkerchief, the only piece of him I had left. I would close my eyes and try to imagine his voice, steady and warm, telling me once more that I mattered, that I was strong, that truth had its own way of rising to the surface. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. Relatives who once smiled at me in family gatherings now avoided me, pretending I didn't exist. My uncle, meanwhile, paraded around with his false dignity, boasting about how he had saved the family by taking charge after my father's death. People believed him. They always believed him. The injustice gnawed at me. I replayed the humiliation over and over. The way he sneered, the way no one defended me, the way I was treated as disposable. Each time, the pain deepened, but so did something else. A quiet resolve began to grow. I realized that silence did not mean weakness. Sometimes silence was a shield, a way to gather strength unseen. I promised myself one thing. I would endure. For as long as it took, I would hold on. My father's memory was too sacred to let my uncle's betrayal destroy me completely. Somewhere deep down, I believed that the truth, whatever it was, would eventually come to light. Weeks turned into months. I lived quietly, unnoticed, bearing the weight of my secret suffering. But all the while, there were whispers I couldn't ignore. Rumors about my father's estate. Conversations cut short when I entered the room. Papers passed between lawyers that my uncle tried desperately to keep hidden. Something was coming. I didn't know what, but I felt it in my bones. My father had always been a careful man. He would never have left me with nothing. My uncle's confidence, his insistence that I was powerless, began to feel more like fear disguised as arrogance. And then one morning a letter arrived. An official notice. The reading of my father's will had been scheduled. For the first time since his death, I felt the flicker of hope. My silence had carried me this far, but now I sensed that the moment of truth was near. The morning of the will reading arrived with a heaviness that pressed against my chest. For months, I had lived like a ghost, invisible and forgotten, carrying the humiliation my uncle had branded onto me. I had almost convinced myself that the world would never remember who I was. But when the official notice came summoning me to the lawyer's office, a spark of something long buried flickered alive inside me. The building stood tall in the heart of the city, its stone walls and glass windows gleaming with an air of authority. I remember standing outside, clutching the letter in my hand, my palms damp with nervous sweat. I hadn't walked into a place like this since my father died. My heart pounded, not just from fear, but from something else, the faint possibility that this day might change everything. When I entered the room, I froze. My uncle was already there, seated in a leather chair, his arms crossed smugly across his chest. His wife sat beside him, her lips curled in disdain as she looked at me. A few other relatives filled the space, cousins who had avoided me since the funeral, now watching me with a mix of curiosity and pity. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with sharp glasses and a calm voice, gestured for me to sit. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Mr. Daniel Miller," he began, using my father's full name with a weight that made my chest tighten. My uncle leaned back, a smirk playing at his lips. He truly believed this day would confirm his dominance, that the estate, the house, the savings, everything my father had worked for, would be handed to him as the self-proclaimed head of the family. I could almost hear his thoughts as he glanced at me. "You'll walk away with nothing." The lawyer unfolded the document and began to read. His voice was steady, echoing through the room like the toll of a bell. "I, Daniel Miller, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this as my last will and testament." I held my breath, waiting. My uncle sat straighter, ready to savor his victory. But then the word shifted. "To my brother, Richard Miller, I leave nothing." The room went silent. My uncle's smirk faltered. He blinked, as though the lawyer had misspoken. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, unmoved. "Your brother, Mr. Daniel Miller, left you nothing. He made his wishes clear." Gasps rippled through the room. My heart leapt, pounding so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. The lawyer continued, his tone firm. "To my only daughter, Sophia Miller, I leave the entirety of my estate, the house, the savings accounts, the business shares, and all personal assets, to be hers alone." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My ears rang with the sound of my father's voice in memory, telling me again and again, "Truth cannot stay buried forever." My uncle shot up from his chair, his face flushed crimson. "This is absurd," he shouted. "She doesn't deserve a thing. I've been the one holding this family together." The lawyer calmly placed the document on the table. "The will is legally binding. Mr. Miller made these decisions himself, and his instructions cannot be altered." I looked around the room. The cousins who once sneered at me now stared in stunned silence. My uncle's wife clutched his arm, whispering in panic. For the first time since my father's death, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. I had been sold like property. I had been humiliated, exiled, stripped of my dignity. But here I sat, the rightful heir to everything my father had left behind. My silence had not been weakness. It had been patience, and now patience had revealed the truth. My uncle glared at me, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But I didn't flinch. For the first time, I met his eyes without fear. Deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of the war between us. He had tried to bury me, but my father's will had unearthed the truth he had worked so hard to hide. As I left the office that day, clutching the signed documents, I didn't just feel like my father's daughter. I felt like someone reborn. My uncle had thought I was powerless, but he had underestimated the strength of both truth and blood. And now, the fight for justice was only beginning. The walk out of the lawyer's office felt unreal, as though I were stepping into a different world than the one I had lived in for months. Just hours earlier, I was still the girl humiliated, thrown out, and sold off like an object. But now, with the weight of my father's will in my hands, I carried proof that my uncle's cruelty would not define my destiny. Word spread quickly. Relatives who once dismissed me now called, their voices suddenly sweet with false concern. "We didn't know your father left you everything, Sophia," they said, pretending sympathy, as though they hadn't turned their faces away when I was humiliated. Their hypocrisy was bitter, but I kept my responses short. I had learned the value of silence. My uncle, however, didn't take the news quietly. Within days, he began a campaign to discredit me. He spread lies, claiming I had manipulated my father in his final days, that I had forced him into changing the will. "She's cunning," I overheard him telling a neighbor. "Daniel wasn't in his right mind. She took advantage." But the truth was clear, and the documents were airtight. The lawyer stood firmly by my father's instructions, and no court could undo them. My uncle's attempts to smear me only made him look desperate. Still, his anger didn't fade. He showed up at the house one evening, his fists pounding on the door so hard I thought it might break. "Open up, Sophia," he bellowed. "This isn't yours. None of this is yours." I stood behind the door, my heart pounding, but I didn't answer. The locks were strong, and for once, I felt secure inside my own walls. Through the window, I saw him pacing on the porch, his face twisted with rage, before he finally stormed off into the night. That was the moment I realized his power over me had slipped away. He could no longer throw me out, no longer sell me, no longer decide my fate. My father had ensured that. The man who once controlled everything now stood on the outside, furious and powerless. But I also knew his hatred would not stop at angry words. Men like him, men fueled by greed and pride, didn't surrender easily. I braced myself, aware that he would try again. And I promised myself that when he did, I would be ready. The community began to see the cracks in his mask. People whispered about the way he had treated me, how quickly he had tried to strip me of everything after my father's death. Old stories resurfaced, shady deals, debts, the times he had cheated others, but managed to silence them with intimidation. Now, with the will exposed, his image of being the responsible one was crumbling. I found strength in these shifting tides. For the first time since losing my father, I walked through the market with my head held high. People who once pitied me now looked at me with curiosity, even respect. I wasn't invisible anymore. But what fueled me most was not the attention. It was the quiet knowledge that I had something my uncle could never take away: my father's faith in me. His decision to leave me everything was not just about money or property. It was his final message, a declaration that I was capable of standing on my own. At night, I still felt the ache of loneliness. I still replayed the humiliation and the pain of being cast aside. But those memories no longer crushed me. Instead, they hardened into resolve. Every cruel word, every betrayal became fuel for the fight I knew was coming. The turning point was not just about inheritance. It was about power, dignity, and justice. My uncle had underestimated me, mistaking my silence for weakness. But silence had been my strength, and now I was ready to speak, ready to fight, ready to reclaim everything he had tried to steal from me. I didn't know then exactly how far his desperation would drive him, or how dangerous his next move would be. But I knew this: the war between us had only just begun. When the lawyer's words had first revealed my father's will, my uncle's face had turned a shade of red I will never forget. But I learned quickly that a man like him wouldn't bow his head and accept defeat. No, humiliation only fueled his rage. And soon, his anger turned into reckless schemes that he thought would strip me of what my father left behind. It started with small acts. Anonymous letters slid under my door, threats scribbled in handwriting I recognized all too well. "You don't deserve this," one note read. Another said, "You'll pay for stealing from me." He was trying to break me down, to make me afraid enough to give in. But fear had already had its time with me. I wasn't the same broken girl he had humiliated at the funeral. Then came the rumors. He told anyone who would listen that I had tricked my father in his final days, convincing him to sign everything over to me. She manipulated a dying man, he told neighbors, his voice dripping with venom. For a while, some people believed him. But the more he ranted, the more he revealed his bitterness, and slowly the community began to see the truth. His greed was speaking louder than his lies. But the breaking point came one night when he showed up at the house again. This time, he didn't just pound on the door. He tried to break in. I woke to the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling hands. For the first time, I wasn't alone in my silence. I was taking action. The police arrived quickly. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the front yard as officers dragged my uncle out, his protests echoing into the night. "This is my house," he shouted, even as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Neighbors gathered, watching the scene unfold. And in that moment, the mask he had worn for so long, the image of being the responsible uncle, shattered completely. I thought his arrest would finally end it, but I was wrong. He bailed himself out the very next morning, his hatred for me burning hotter than ever. That was when I made my decision. I would no longer sit in silence. My father's will had given me more than an inheritance. It had given me the strength to fight back. I contacted my lawyer. Together, We began building a case, not just to protect what was rightfully mine, but to hold my uncle accountable for everything he had done. The humiliation, the threats, the break-in, all of it became evidence. Witnesses came forward, people who had seen how he treated me after the funeral, how he had spoken about selling me like property. One woman, a neighbor, even confessed she had overheard him bragging about the $20,000 deal. When the case finally went to court, my uncle's arrogance worked against him. He strutted into the courtroom, his chin high, convinced he could charm his way out of the truth. But the evidence stacked up quickly. The judge listened carefully as my lawyer presented every document, every statement, every detail of his cruelty. I sat quietly, my hands clasped in my lap, watching the man who had once controlled every part of my life squirm under the weight of justice. He interrupted the proceedings often, shouting that I was a liar, that the will was forged, that I was trying to ruin him. But his words only made him look unstable. And then came the moment I'll never forget. The judge turned to him, her eyes sharp as steel. "You exploited your niece at her most vulnerable moment. You tried to strip her of her dignity and her rightful inheritance. This court finds you guilty of fraud, attempted coercion, and unlawful harassment." My uncle's face went pale. For the first time, he had no words. The sentence was handed down, years in prison, with no chance to weasel his way out. The very man who had sold me, humiliated me, and tried to break me would now lose the one thing he valued most, his freedom. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun seemed brighter, the air lighter. I thought of my father, and I knew in my heart that justice had finally been served. My silence had carried me through the darkest days, but my voice had won me back my dignity. The community looked at me differently now. No longer as the girl who had been cast aside, but as a woman who had stood against betrayal and reclaimed her life. Neighbors who once turned away now nodded in respect. And though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, I carried them as proof of my strength. Justice was mine, and revenge, sweet, undeniable revenge, had been delivered in the form of truth, law, and dignity. But even as I celebrated, I knew my journey wasn't over. My father's legacy was now in my hands, and with it came not just freedom, but responsibility. When the gavel struck and my uncle was sentenced, it felt as though a heavy chain had finally fallen from my shoulders. For months, I had lived in the shadow of betrayal, carrying grief in one hand and humiliation in the other. But now, standing outside the courthouse with the verdict echoing in my ears, I finally breathed freely. Justice was not just a word on paper, it had become real, tangible, something I could feel in my very bones. The house that my uncle once threw me out of was mine again. Walking through its doors no longer carried the sting of loss, but the warmth of restoration. I ran my hands along the walls, whispering, "I'm home, Dad." The silence no longer felt empty, it felt protective, like the house itself was embracing me after everything I had endured. With the inheritance secured, I had choices I never dreamed I'd have. For so long, my future felt stolen, like my life was something others could decide, bargain, or sell. But now, every decision rested in my hands. I decided to honor my father's memory by investing in the business he had worked so hard to build. I met with partners, studied contracts, and slowly began to step into the role he once carried. Each day, I found myself becoming stronger, sharper, more confident. But rebuilding wasn't just about money or property. It was about reclaiming who I was. For the first time, I decorated the house not to please others, but to reflect myself. I painted the walls brighter, filled the shelves with books my father loved, and planted a small garden in the backyard. Every flower that bloomed felt like a piece of healing, a reminder that life could grow even after devastation. People who once ignored me now reached out, some out of guilt, others out of genuine remorse. I listened politely, but I didn't forget. Forgiveness was not something I could hand out easily, not after everything I endured. My uncle had shown me the darkest side of greed, and the silence of others had cut nearly as deep as his cruelty. Still, I no longer needed their validation. Respect, I realized, is most powerful when it is earned, and I had earned mine. There were nights when I still dreamed of the funeral, of his voice telling me I was nothing, of the cold eyes that turned away. But I would wake up to the safety of my own bed, surrounded by the legacy my father entrusted to me. And I would remember I had won. I wasn't the broken girl they tried to bury. I wasn't the one silenced, humiliated, or sold. I was the daughter my father believed in, the heir he chose, the woman who had risen from betrayal stronger than ever. As I stood one evening in the garden, the sun setting over the horizon, I whispered again to my father, "They tried to bury me, Dad. But you knew. You always knew I was stronger than them." For the first time in a long time, I smiled, not just because justice had been served, but because I finally believed in myself. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. A story not defined by betrayal, but by survival, justice, and the courage to rise again.